This morning, I want to talk about icons of evolution. And an icon is an image. And if you see an image often enough, you're going to believe that what that image depicts is true. And so that's what this talk is all about. Even evolutionists will say that. Ernst Mayr, who is a well-known Harvard evolutionist, has said that no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. So here's a scientist saying that evolution is a fact. Another one, again an evolutionist, saying nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, I want to set a few definitions before us before we get into the talk about the icons of evolution itself. And I think Steve said it well this morning, saying that science is really the search for truth. We don't want to get caught in naturalistic science, science being just naturalism. Science is really the search for truth. And I want to distinguish between theories and what I call a model, because when we go into the workshop this afternoon talking about science as evidence for either for creation or evolution, we're going to look at evolution and creation as a model, not as a theory, because a theory is something that is falsifiable. And these 5 things that I show here. Fact is something that it can be proven to be true. Nobody really questions. Nobody questions, for example, the law of gravity. Everybody believes that the law of gravity is true. A theory is something, on the other hand, that is testable, it is falsifiable, and it is based on empirical findings. Hypothesis, next one is something that is what I call pre-theory. It provisionally explains some facts, but perhaps not all of them. And then a model is a simplified representation of reality. So those are the words we're going to use this morning and also this afternoon in the workshop. A few things about the theory of evolution. If evolution is to be considered a theory, a theory is really a time-tested concept that makes useful, dependable predictions about the natural world. It must therefore make accurate predictions, not have any known contradictions, and be repeatable. Evolution is they say, is based on random mutations. You cannot make dependable predictions based on random mutations, for one thing. Evolution has many known contradictions, as we'll see. It has happened in the past and therefore is not repeatable. It's not an experiment that we can repeat. Science has limitations. Okay, let me just step forward in the interest of time. I want to talk a little bit about biological evolution. This is the theory that all living things are modified descendants of a common ancestor that lived in the distant past. We are all descendants of ape-like ancestors, the theory of evolution would say. Apes are themselves descendants of more primitive animals. Living things share common ancestors. We all come from one living cell, so to speak. Evolution, for it to be true, requires time and lots of it, billions of years, in fact. So if evolution is true, where's the evidence? Has somebody shown that life can really happen from non-life? Are there transitional fossils that we will recognize, we'd all recognize and say, yep, they're evidence that evolution really did happen? Does the geological column exist? Are new species appearing today? Old species dying off? Are there such things as beneficial mutations? Increasing complexity in living organisms? We'd expect to find evidence of all of these things. Where is it? Evolution is under attack. Last night we talked about intelligent design. That's really attacking the theory of evolution. Creationism, of course, attacks the theory of evolution. We talked about the intelligent design movement. The last book I have shown there, Icons of Evolution, written by Jonathan Wells, who's associated with the Discovery Institute here in Seattle and is a fairly well-known author in the field. And that's the book we're going to use as a source of much of the information that I'm going to talk about this morning. In fact, here's the book. I think it's probably out on the table there too if you want to look at it and read it to check out some of these ideas. And what his book is really about and what we're going to talk about is that icons, if you see an icon, and this icon here on that book, you've all seen it. You know, an ape on all fours moving into man walking on 2 feet. Okay, you've seen it so often that you think it's true. Okay, that's what an icon is. This is what we call the ultimate icon of evolution. There are other icons too, which you may not know about, which we're going to talk about this morning. So the point is, if you see this icon in every textbook, you're going to start to believe, hey, maybe that's true. Scientists, after all, know what they're talking about, don't they? But don't forget, you're talking to naturalistic scientists when they talk about these icons. And this book has gotten some pretty rave reviews, some very good reviews. And I'm not going to read all the words there, just to say the underlying parts of the examples in the book are well drawn and documented. He gives great evidence for what he's talking about there. Okay, this didn't show. Okay, here you go. And next one, Philip Johnson, who's one of the leaders of the intelligent design movement, also references that book, and yeah, he thinks highly of it, as do I. Some other comments. It talks about defects in some of the examples shown in this book, and I'm going to talk about 10 of those very quickly. And here are some of the things that he says, and we'll look at some of those details in a bit. So the book covers 10 icons of evolution, and we're going to walk through each of those 10 in rapid succession here. Some of those you've heard about, and some of them you may not. You know, Darwin's tree of life. Everything started from one simple living cell. And the very first one, where did that first cell come from, that first living cell? Well, that's the Miller experiment is all about. And I'll talk about each one of these 10. So let me just jump right into it. The Miller-Urey experiment, run in 1953, based on some presuppositions or hypotheses put out by Oper and Haldane back in the early 1920s. They surmised that some primordial sea contains some what they call hot dilute soup, some liquid from which the first living cells emerged. And of course, that doesn't answer the question, well, where did that living soup come from? The hot dilute soup. Where did the water come from in the first place? They don't answer all those questions. But it captured the imagination of many scientists. And then Miller-Urey, those two scientists came along, 1953, ran this experiment and claimed to say that they found a way that they could produce living cells, at least the components of living cells, from non-living matter. So immediately, this experiment found its way into science books that were used in that time frame. And in fact, the whole point of this is that this experiment, these pictures, still appear in many of the high school and college textbooks today. And let me just point you to a few things in this picture. This equipment that they used to, quote, prove that life could be formed from non-life, the experiment was designed, right? They set up a certain environment which they assumed simulated the environment on early Earth. Okay, that's one point you want to remember. Just some basic terminologies because when we talk about some of these experiments and some other icons, you have to keep in mind, you all know what atoms is, comprised of neutrons and protons and electrons. The molecules are these atoms, bonded together chemically, and then amino acids are specific arrangements of molecules, and then proteins themselves are arrangements of amino acids. And proteins is living matter. Amino acids themselves are not living matter, in isolation. So you need strings of these specific arrangements. Well, what did they produce in this experiment? They produced what are recognized as building blocks of life. They produced amino acids. They did not produce proteins. Okay, they produced some other things, but nothing that is life itself. They didn't produce They didn't produce the proton itself. Some building blocks were found, not the actual macromolecules. And there were some other molecules along with them. Okay, however, one has to recognize that first of all, that the atmosphere that they simulated, consisting of ammonia, water, hydrogen, and methane, notice that it did not include oxygen. Did the early atmosphere really not have oxygen? Well, they assumed it couldn't have, because if it had oxygen, it would oxidize and life couldn't form. Okay, well, later on they found examples of rocks which were dated to be 3.7 billion years old using the evolutionary dating model, and it showed that Earth had to have had some oxygen. So first of all, their environment that they used was incorrect. So they assumed the wrong gas mixture. The experiment produced the wrong amino acids. It produced right-handed. There are two kinds of amino acids, right-handed and left-handed amino acids. They produced only right-handed amino acids. Life consists of left-handed amino acids. It doesn't have right-handed amino acids. So they found the wrong ones in the first place. And there's only 20 different ones that make up living matter. So the experiment was proven to be false. It did not produce the right results. Here's what some scientists say. The likelihood of life having occurred through a chemical accident is, for all intents and purposes, 0. Okay, another one, Freeman Dyson, The Origins of Life. Since Miller's beguiling picture of a pond full of dissolved amino acids under a reducing atmosphere has been discredited, a new beguiling picture has come to take its place. Okay, it's been discredited. Even evolutionists don't regard it as good evidence of life forming from non-life. However, your textbooks that your students are learning from in high school and in college still contain that picture. Many of those textbooks still contain that picture because they don't have a better story to tell on how life may have formed from non-life. There is no mention of the experiment's flaws, the ones that I just mentioned here. So it leaves students with the impression that it demonstrates how life's building blocks formed on the early Earth. Number 2, another icon. And we'll show some other pictures, but this is the drawing on the right is actually taken from Darwin's notebook that he kept, for his science recordings back in 1837, and showing an early tree of how life started, from one living cell, and everything just sort of branched out into the life that we know today. And so this really covers his theory there. I'm not going to read through that. And by the way, all of these slides will be on the net later on after this conference, so you can always go back and look at some of these details later. Evolution of life, and this is what evolutionists believe. All species evolved over billions of years from a common ancestor. That's their basic statement. And I'm sure you've seen pictures like this of the geological time scale showing the fossils that have been discovered and putting them into the different layers. And then, as you heard this morning, using the fossils as index fossils to indicate which layer they really belong to. So it's, again, the circular reasoning thing, which students don't really fully appreciate because they don't talk about that in textbooks. But if you look at some discussion of this, you'll see that there's a lot of circular reasons discussed. Here's an interesting statement from Darwin himself. He assumes that life started from one cell and then it just branched out, and there should be transitional fossils all along that path. And he says, why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. He assumed at that point when he wrote the book back in 1859 that scientists would find these missing links. That was his assumption. And his theory, he understood his theory being valid depending on scientists finding those missing links. Well, here's an example. We call this a living fossil. The coelacanth, a fish, was assumed to be extinct 70 million years ago, according to scientists back in the early 1900s. Well, guess what? 1938, they found living coelacanth. They still exist. The species still exist, and they look exactly like the fossils would have said they'd be. So how can they be extinct if they're still living? This is just one example, of a living fossil. So what does the evidence say? There is no question that such gaps exist. A big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian is one of the rock layers, which is assumed to be about 500 million years ago, and that's where supposedly the life started. Okay, so they say a big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. That shouldn't be. According to the theory of evolution, you should see, single-celled, multi-celled living organisms at that lower layer in the Cambrian, and then gradually becoming more complex according to evolution. Well, they don't see that. And, it's one of the things we're going to look into in the workshop in a little bit more detail. Another zoologist says, however, we have virtually no evidence in the fossil record or elsewhere for any of the changes proposed during this immensity of time. But the public hears nothing of this problem. So, and there's a lot more evidence, but basically Darwin's tree of life has been debunked. Living things are all very different. If you look at the fossils in the Cambrian layers, there are fossils of living organisms that look the same then as they do today. That shouldn't be, according to the theory. The fossil record shows that phylum-level differences appear at the lowest levels, that is in the Cambrian period. This has often been referred to as the Cambrian explosion. So there's no fossil evidence connecting the Cambrian animals to organisms preceding them in the so-called Precambrian period. There is no long history of gradual diversion as depicted or predicted by Darwin. The Cambrian explosion gave rise to most of the animal phyla alive today, as well as some phyla that are now extinct. Certainly there are species that are extinct. There's no question about that over the years. But it's interesting that the fossils show the phyla much as they exist today. So there hasn't been all this change that would be predicted by the theory of evolution. So, there are different arguments put forth by evolutionists, but basically the fossil record does not support Darwin's tree of life. It just isn't there. Here's a well-known paleontologist from the British Museum of Natural History. He said, "I fully agree with your comment on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Not one. Credible transition fossil. Ernst Mayr, who we quoted from before. "Given the fact of evolution," notice he says the fact, "one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants." But this is not what paleontologists find. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. This is a scientist who states that evolution is a fact, and yet there's no evidence. He agrees that there's no evidence. Third, homology. Homology is similarity. In this case, we show bone structures which are recognized as similar. Now, that could be because two reasons. One, they evolved. I mean, they started as one form and then they just evolved into different forms, just like Darwin said they would. Second, they could have been designed that way. So, again, the facts speak for themselves. The interpretation depends on your worldview. So this shows forelimbs of 4 different living organisms, and yet those forelimbs are used for different purposes by the bat, the porpoise, the horse, and the human. Creationists regard organisms as constructed on a common plan, a common design, designed for similar or even different purposes. Darwin explained homology on the basis of the theory of descent with slow and slight modifications. In other words, one of those, he used that as evidence that one evolved from the other. The evolutionist explanation attributes homologous features to similar genes inherited from a common ancestor. Well, it has now been shown, I don't think I have anything on that here, but the genes in some of these similar looking bone structures are actually different. The genes are different. There's no evidence that one evolved from the other. So then, they play words here, play with their words. Darwin's followers later redefined homology to mean similarity due to common ancestry. Okay? Again, it's built right into it. That's like saying science only talks about naturalism, materialism. So it's redefining the terms. It's hijacking the terms to suit their purposes. And that's just circular reasoning. You really have to think that through. So again, this whole theory has been debunked. An example, the development of the digits, that's the fingers, toes, proceeds from the posterior to the anterior direction in frogs. So in salamanders, who are supposed to be, they're supposed to have evolved one from the other, the digits proceed from head to tail. So they go in different directions, and yet the evolutionists would say one was evolved from the other. So it's been discovered that, this is what I mentioned before, it's also been discovered that non-homologous structures commonly arise from identical genes. Here's a biologist himself saying in 1971, the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor cannot be ascribed to identity of genes. So again, homology has been debunked as evidence for evolution. And yet, what do we find? They're still in your textbooks that your students are learning from. Here's another one, a different kind of example, Haeckel's embryos. What he proposed is that embryos start, real small. I mean, you've all seen the picture of a baby in a woman's stomach. As it develops, it changes shape. Okay, and Haeckel says what the embryo is doing, it's going through the different stages of evolution. It starts looking like a fish or some other animal that we all evolved from, supposedly, and then goes through different stages. It recapitulates the history of evolution. That's what he said. So he picked 8 different embryos, showing fish, salamander, tortoise, etc., representing 5 of the 7 vertebrate classes. He omitted 2 classes for a good purpose because they didn't fit his theory very well. And half of the embryos are mammals, thus using a very biased sample. But what else is wrong with that picture? First of all, Darwin relied on Haeckel. Okay, he depended on his work. In the Origin of Species book, Darwin says the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but becomes, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. Now, they start looking the same, but eventually they become dissimilar because they grow into different kinds of organisms. With many animals, the embryonic or larval stages show us more or less completely the condition of the progenitor of the whole group in its adult stage. So he considered these similarities in early embryos by far, note, by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory. So we have here that Darwin's theory depended on the fossil record. It depended on embryos, the evolution of embryos. Those 2 things. Well, it's been determined quite a while ago, actually, not just recently, that Haeckel's pictures of embryos were really a fraud. Really a fraud. The dissimilarity of early embryos has been well known for more than a century. Notice the embryos that he showed at the first level. They were actually at different stages of growth in those different living organisms. It wasn't the starting period. It was somewhere up the curve. Haeckel's drawings are misleading in 3 ways. They included only those classes and orders that came close to fitting his theory. He ignored the other ones, just took ones that seemed to fit his theory. They distort the embryos they purport to show, and they entirely omit early stages in which vertebrate embryos look very different. Evidence twisted to fit a theory. Okay, he took selected facts of the life of an embryo and put them into a theory that he wanted to prove. Recently, a story came out here, 1997, Haeckel's embryos, the fraud rediscovered. In other words, it's known to be a fraud. Okay, this is a recent story, 1997. It's known to be a fraud, I believe, in the early 1900s, it was recognized as a fraud. So why is it still appearing in textbooks? Fukuyama is a well-known textbook writer. Okay, he now knows that the Haeckel's embryos are fraud. It's a fraud. What does he say? As such, if textbooks use the drawings at all, it is as an historical example and as a way to illustrate the concept in such a way that students are able to grasp it immediately. Even if the drawings are fraudulent, they can still be used for this purpose because the concept they illustrate is by no means fraudulent. How does that work? Ignore the facts, ignore the data, just stick to your theory. Okay? Molecular biology booklets going around, put out by the National Academy of Sciences, of all organizations. Early developmental stages of animals whose adult forms appear radically different are often surprisingly similar. Darwinian mechanisms explain why embryos of different species so often resemble each other in their early stages, and as such, and as they develop, sometimes seem to replay the steps of evolution. That's in recent booklets put out by the National Academy of Sciences, and yet they know that Haeckel's embryos, the pictures, are fraud. So the deception continues. Here's another one. That long word, hard to pronounce, Archaeopteryx, the so-called missing link. 1861, Hermann von Meyer described a fossil that appeared to be an intermediate between reptiles and birds, and called it this Archaeopteryx, an ancient wing. The fossil had wings and feathers, but it also had teeth, a long lizard-like tail, and claws on the wings. Seemed to be an intermediate fossil. A more complete specimen found in 1877, and this is the missing link that confirmed the theory of evolution for many people. Okay, that just clinched it for a lot of people. So, how does a reptile turn into a bird? If you look at a reptile and you look at a bird, here's the things that are different. Obviously, reptiles don't have feathers. The respiratory system is totally different. The skeleton system is different. Birds obviously have hollow bones. Reptiles do not. And they have hollow bones for reasons, for flight. The digestive system is totally different. The nervous system is different. Bills and beaks have to be constructed on a bird. Mastery of nest building, acquisition of flight, and the development of a sound-producing organ. All of these things have to evolve somehow, and they're so different. How can that be? Okay, what was it? What was this animal? Today, paleontologists agree that the Archaeopteryx is not the ancestor of modern birds. Its own ancestors are the subject of one of the most heated controversies in modern science. It is not regarded as the world's most beautiful fossil, but it's not only regarded as the world's most beautiful fossil, but has become a powerful icon of the evolutionary process itself. Even as late as 1982, Ernst Mayr called this fossil the most perfect link between reptiles and birds. However, too many structural differences were identified between this fossil and modern birds for modern birds to be descendants of the Archaeopteryx. What was it? It was a bird. Okay, most paleontologists now believe that it is not an ancestor of the modern bird, but it is the bird itself. It is a bird. It has all the characteristics of a bird. So it has been abandoned as an example of a missing link. Yet that picture still appears in textbooks. It still appears. So there's another one that they found recently, and National Geographic, one of the great evolution magazines that you all read, says this Archaeopteryx from China was a missing link. Well, guess what? Turned out to be fabrication. Another one unveiled in Florida in 2000, Bambiraptor. What's next? I mean, they're still looking. Missing, like ICR says, missing links are still missing. Here's another one that is used as evidence for evolution, the peppered moth. You can see here pictures of a dark peppered moth on the bottom and a light peppered moth on the top. And the theory says that if a peppered moth, a dark-colored peppered moth, is on a light-colored tree, it stands out. Okay, so predators can pick it up quite easily. And so in the days of the early 19th century, when pollution wasn't a problem, the trees were light-colored, and the moths were peppered and dark, and the predators could pick them out easy. Okay, so the dark ones disappeared, and the light-colored predominated. Well, when pollution became an issue, the dark-colored ones became more prominent because the dark ones could hide on the darker tree barks, as shown on the top there. And so that appeared to be an example of natural selection and evolution. It's not the full picture, but it seems like that could support evolution. So here's this scientist, Bernard Kettleworth. He performed some experiments to prove this, and this is in the 1900s now. That suggests that predatory birds ate light-colored moths when they became more visible on pollution-darkened tree trunks. It appeared that natural selection played a role in the survival of the dark-colored ones, and most biology textbooks today illustrate this example of natural selection, great example of natural selection, with photographs showing two varieties of pepper moths resting on light and dark-colored tree trunks. What the textbooks do not tell you is that these photographs have been staged, since peppered moths in the wild do not rest on tree trunks. They don't rest on tree trunks. Problems with the evidence. The percentage of melanics, which are dark-colored ones, predicted by the theory did not materialize in the different areas of England. Some areas, melanism increased after the introduction of pollution control. How can that be? That's counter the theory of evolution. So the results of his experiments were not as dependent on the presence of lichens as he had thought. Okay. Moths were manually placed in the desired positions for the experiments. That is, the photographs were staged. This cast serious doubt on the validity of his experiment. Later, biologists state the evidence that Darwin lacked, Kettleworth lacked as well. In other words, Kettleworth's experiments didn't show that evolution was true. The story of industrial melanism must be shelved as a paradigm of new Darwinian evolution. Darwin's missing evidence for natural selection is still missing. Number 7. Here's an example of Darwin's finches. Darwin studied a number of finches on the Galapagos Islands while he was out there on his voyage in the 1800s. He determined that the finches differ mainly in the size and shape of their beaks. The various species were concluded to be the result of natural selection, since the beaks of the finches are adapted to the different foods that they eat. And it's noteworthy to say that Darwin himself, didn't use this as an example in his book, Origin of Species. He didn't use this. Scientists later claimed this as evidence for evolution. So Darwin himself shouldn't be given credit for this. And the other thing that's noteworthy here, the natural selection observed in the 1970s in these experiments reversed direction soon after, resulting in no net evolutionary change. And by the changes that we're going to look at is the changes in the finch's beak size. The beak size grew over time. That could be, beak size can be measured, and they grew over time because of the changes in the environment. When a drought came, the finches had to dig deeper to get food, and it turns out that their beaks grew by 5%. And you'll see what evolutionists did with that in a bit. It is definitely an icon of evolution today. Darwin was increasingly given credit after 1947 for finches he never saw and for observations and insights about them he never made. They were on the Galapagos Islands, but that doesn't mean that he studied them just because he went there. Darwin attributed the differences in bill size and feeding habits among these finches to evolution that occurred after their ancestors migrated to the Galapagos Islands, 1998. Grant ran some experiments in 1970s. Here's what he found. He found that drought reduced the availability of seeds, resulting in a 15% reduction of the one island's median ground finch population. Survivors tended to have slightly larger bodies and beaks, and this is because of the drought. They had to have longer beaks to find the food. Natural selection favored those birds capable of cracking the tough, large seeds that remain. The average beak depth increased by 5%. His conclusions, he said, natural selection can produce changes in beaks. This could also explain the origin of species among Darwin's finches. it would require, and here's an interesting conclusion, it would require 20 such selection events to transform one species into another. With one drought each 10 years, let's say a drought came every 10 years, this would take about only 200 years to change one species of finch into another species of finch. However, chromosome studies show that there are no differences among the finches. No natural selection in the wild has been observed, and finches are still finches today. I mean, there has been no evolution. Later experiments, and this is when the rains returned, drought disappeared, rain returned, the increase in finch population, the average beak size returned to its previous size. It reversed. You know, microevolution does occur, we believe. There's evidence for microevolution. I mean, organisms adapt to their environment. You know, we adapt to our environment. Animals adapt to their environment. So there are oscillating selection happening, but that doesn't mean it's a one-directional move, you know, larger beak size and what have you. So, in fact, they've also observed that several species of finch appeared to be merging into one. And finches seem to be oscillating between diverging and merging. Perhaps there aren't that many different species after all. So, again, what does the National Academy of Science do with this? It describes Darwin's finches as a particularly compelling example of the origin of species. It still gives it as an example. And yet, scientists, even evolutionists, will say it's not a good example. I mean, it's seen the beak size go larger, smaller, you know, oscillating. It's not a good example. Here's number 8, a four-winged fruit fly. I mean, you've all seen fruit flies. You know that fruit flies can reproduce rapidly. So scientists have taken fruit flies and, you know, produced different generations of fruit flies and tried to get evolution to work, you know, to observe evolution happening quickly. Genes consisting of DNA are the carriers of hereditary information. You know, we know that. Human genes contain hereditary information. New variations originate as mutations, and however, most mutations are harmful. And that's what evolutionists don't give enough credence to. In fact, by most, I say it's been shown that probably one mutation out of 1,000 is a beneficial mutation. Okay, you can read some of this yourself here. Third point, unless a mutation affects morphology, that is the shape of an organism, it cannot provide raw materials for morphological evolution. Morphological mutations have been extensively studied in the fruit fly. Some mutations cause the two-winged fruit fly to develop a second pair of wings. That seems to be evolution in the works. You know, two sets of wings from one. However, you have to note that four-winged fruit flies do not occur spontaneously. They must be bred in the laboratory from 3 artificially maintained mutant strains. So they don't occur in the wild. It's just under these certain circumstances that you have in the lab that you could produce these four-winged fruit flies. Guess what? Those extra wings are useless. They lack flight muscles. They testify to the skill of geneticists. I mean, it's design involved, you know, because scientists are designing the experiment. It's just like the origin of life experiment. You know, they designed the experiment. But they do help us to understand the role of genes in development. They provide no evidence that DNA mutations supply the raw materials for morphological evolution. No useful organism has been produced, and the organism cannot reproduce itself. I mean, it's a dead end. It just doesn't go anywhere. So the four-winged fruit fly does not provide the missing evidence for evolution. It's still a fruit fly. Okay? And evolutionists will back that up. It'll say geneticists have found that the number of wings in flies can be changed through mutations in a single gene. That's what it says in the National Academy of Sciences booklet. So they're insinuating that this can still be evidence of evolution, even though it has been shown by evolutionists and scientists that this is not good evidence. A ninth one we have here is fossil horses as an example of directed evolution. Again, there's some presuppositions about when some of these so-called fossils lived. The whole claim is that horses evolved into single-toed animals from four-toed animals. That's the whole claim. And this was invented by Mr. Marsh back in the 1870s. He gathered animals from all over the world, arranged them in the order he thought they would have evolved, though the animals are not found in that order. He assumed what would, something that would prove evolution, and then he found animals which seemed to show that. Again, circular reasoning. The basis of the theory, the four-toed up to the one-toed, similarities in the horse skull, similarities in leg bones. And here's a picture showing the supposed evolution of horses. Okay, and they're just some quotes from different evolutionists. Another quote on horse theory: the record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. In other words, the whole story of horse evolution has been thrown out the window. It's no longer regarded as reputable evidence of evolution. Okay, so there is no consensus on horse ancestry among paleontologists. You've all seen different sizes of horses. The Clydesdale, you may not have seen that small Falabella horse there, but there it is. And so, again, there have been no credible transitional fossils found of these horses, so-called horses. So the missing links are still missing. And then what we call the ultimate icon. This is, moving from ape to human. That's the ultimate icon. You've all seen that. I mean, that's plastered all over the media as if it's a fact. The guy on the left there knows better. Darwin's human evolution theory. That drawing that I just showed was developed before there was any so-called evidence. So again, it was assumed that evolution was true. It was assumed that we evolved from an ape, so they started to draw on the picture, and then they started to look for these transitional fossils. And this picture has been reproduced in almost all biology textbooks and museum exhibits today. There have been numerous is probably too large a word, but there have been some fossils discovered that appear to be the transitional links in the evolutionary chain leading to today's human beings. You see them reported in the news even today. When somebody finds a human fossil in Africa, they said, oh, we found another missing link in the human evolution. It has been shown that many interpretations of the fossil evidence for human evolution were influenced by personal beliefs or prejudice. Here's 6 well-known examples of so-called transitions between apes and human beings. Okay, in the workshop this afternoon, I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. But these are 6 well-known examples of so-called human transition fossils. The Neanderthal man, found in 1850s, a fossil of that man in Europe. It has now been accepted as a Homo sapiens, in other words, a human, a fossil of a human. It just happened to have arthritis, and that's why it seemed to be so bent over. It had a disease. Java man, shown to be an artificial construct. Piltdown man, totally a hoax. Nebraska man, that picture, as I'll show you this afternoon, they constructed a complete picture, an artist's rendition of what that man looked like, and it was later shown that it was all based on one tooth, and that tooth turned out to be an extinct pig. Ramapithecus turns out to be really just an orangutan. And then Lucy, who you've heard about, will show that's totally make-believe, not based on any real evidence. So, in conclusion, paleontologists have a tendency to reconstruct fossils to make what they want out of it. A single set of fossil bones can be reconstructed in many different ways based on the assumptions made by the paleontologist and, very importantly, the artist. If it wasn't for the artist, we wouldn't have these pictures. These pictures are based on artists' perceptions. Some scientists have correctly stated that to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but certainly not scientific. So these 10 icons that you've all seen, or at least you've seen some of them, they are, the tragedy is that even evolutionists will agree that none of these are valid evidences for the theory of evolution, supporting the theory of evolution. These icons still appear in your children's textbooks. They still appear in your textbook that you use in college. And that's what we need to communicate to our children and grandchildren. Jonathan did a fairly complete analysis of, I think, about 10 different textbooks, and he graded them saying, A, it treats evolution as a theory, and that's really the correct way to do it. B, describes the issue clearly. C, discusses possible problems. D, it assumes it's true, and it even assumes it's a fact, even though it can't be proven it's a fact. It just assumes it's a fact. And F, totally misleading. Haeckel's embryos, pictures of Haeckel's embryos. If that appears in a textbook, we know that's a fraud, and it's totally misleading. So that would be marked as an F. Most of those 10 textbooks, he graded them for those 10 different icons. Most of the gradings are D and F. D and F. Very, very disconcerting. As scientists, you like people to be, unbiased. But these are totally biased presentations. So why do the evolutionists still carry these, or why do the textbooks still carry these icons? Well, for one, we know evolutionists will not acknowledge the supernatural power, and they don't have a better alternative. They have to have something to support their theory, so they leave it in there. Jonathan makes a very interesting statement. He says, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evidence. Evolutionists will say nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So totally different view. It's a different worldview. So scientists are questioning the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be unsupported by the evidence. The 10 examples I gave to you here all lack evidence, and yet they are still in the textbooks. That is what is most disconcerting. Jonathan has written a new book, and you'll like the title, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design. So if you enjoy his book on the icons of evolution, you'll enjoy reading this book as well, because it totally debunks, the theory of evolution. So thank you for your attention again.